So, good afternoon and good morning for those who are in Australia when it is tomorrow morning. I'm Alon Confino. I'm the director of the Institute for Holocaust, Genocide and Memory Studies at UMass Amherst. I'm delighted to have you with us in this International Day of Remembrance of the Holocaust. We have a very special guest and a very special book about which I'm going to talk in a second. Just a few housekeeping things. This is a webinar. You can now see the list of participants, but in about 5 minutes or so, it will disappear and you'll have only me and David. Please ask us questions. We are going to discuss things for about 45 minutes, and then we want to have a conversation with you all. You see the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please write down your questions there. I'd like to remind you that you can subscribe to the Institute's email list by sending us an email or by putting it in the chat. You can like us on Facebook, and you can visit our YouTube channel for a recording of this talk and all our talks. Yeah. So in 1978, Jakub Slucki passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 77. A Holocaust survivor whose first wife and 2 sons had been murdered in the Nazi death camp in Chelmno in Poland, Jakub lived a turbulent life. Just over 37 years later, his son, Charles, died of a heart attack. David Slucki, who is with us, wrote a book, Sing This at My Funeral, a memoir of fathers and sons. And he tells the story of his father and his grandfather and the grave legacy that they each passed on to him. This is a story about the Holocaust and its aftermath, about absences and scars that don't heal, about fathers and sons and what it means to raise young men. It's also a story about ghosts, as we will discuss. David is Lotte Smorgon Associate Professor in Contemporary Jewish Life and Culture at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. He's the author of the book, and he's also the author of the International Jewish Labor Bund after 1945, Toward a Global History. He's the co-editor of Laughter After, Humor and the Holocaust, which he co-edited with Avinoam Pat and Gabi Finder, who are with us today. I'm very happy to have them with us. And the Institute is going to have a special event for this book in the fall with Avinoam, Gabi, and David. So please join us also for this. Hi, David. It's very good to see you and to have you with us. And good morning.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. I only wish it was in person.
Absolutely. We are all tired of COVID, but we still have a few more months to live with it. I'd like to begin, David, by maybe you can tell us what is the book about.
So, I mean, I think you encapsulated it nicely with the blow of an introduction, but I'll give a little bit more detail. The book it's a multi-generation family memoir. So, you know, people used to laugh at me when I said I'm writing a memoir, and they said, a memoir about who? And I said, me. And that's like a bit of a simplification to say it's about me, because really more than it being about me, it's about my father and grandfather, and about the experience my grandfather had of surviving the war. But even more than it being about his survival, it's about the kind of aftermath and the legacy that left for him as a survivor, as a father, as a husband, and the ways in which those things filtered down to my dad and the way he filtered them down through me. And, you know, in a way, I think it's I say it's a 3-generation memoir, but I really think it's a 5-generation memoir, because I write also about my grandfather's father, who passed away, or who was murdered, I should say, during the First World War by German occupying soldiers. And it's also about my son and my own kind of sort of feelings and thoughts about how to raise a young man in the wake of so much that's gone before. So I wouldn't say the book is kind of linear in structure. It's not a narrative that sort of starts at one point and finishes at another. It's very, it sounds, I don't want it to sound too pretentious to say, but, you know, as I was writing it, I thought a little about Proust and the Way by Swans, and the way that kind of memories stir sort of thought, new things that come up. And I sort of, as I was writing, I kind of followed the memories as they came up and the ideas. So there's kind of something a bit stream of consciousness maybe about the way I structured each chapter around certain themes. There is a kind of underlying chronology, but it's not like a biography that follows my family from start to finish. It's really about in other words, not just about that story, it's about the implications of that story and how I sort of think about it, you know, in different moments in time, I guess.
You write at the end of the introduction that this is not a linear story, but it's a fragmented story that goes back into the past and then the present, and this is very well laid out. Just before I continue with this conversation, I'd like to tell the audience that if you look at the chat, there is a link to buy David's book, and there is also a password that if you put in the Wayne State University Press website, you can get 30% off.
So please go and buy it.
Of course.
I guess I should also like talk a little bit about what it actually is about, when, you know, yes, the actual story. Just so people know. So my grandfather was born in Warsaw in 1901. So it's sort of a generation older actually than like most of my friends' grandparents. When my dad was born, he was an older dad. He had his parents were both died during World War I, and he left Warsaw to this small city of Wrocławek, about 100 kilometers from Warsaw, where when he was about 17 or 18. We don't know the exact date that he moved, and we don't know the exact reason he moved. At some stage around that time, when he was 16, 17, 18, he discovered the Jewish Labor Bund, socialist, Yiddish-oriented, diaspora-oriented organization. And he sort of immersed himself in this political movement. He married, he had 2 sons. He married Gittel and had 2 sons, Shmulek and Chaim. And they lived, you know, a kind of, what I would say is a fairly typical life of interwar Polish Jews. They were certainly not well off. My Zeta was a white-collar worker, a bookkeeper. And when the war broke out in 1939, the Nazis occupied Wrocławek, and in late November, so a couple of months after the occupation, they decided that and this is a kind of longer story that I get into in the book, but as a family, they decided he should flee to the Soviet Union, thinking that he was vulnerable as a socialist and that he might get targeted by the Nazis. And his wife and 2 sons stayed behind. So he survived the rest of the war in the Soviet Union in Siberia, while his wife and 2 sons were murdered at the Chelmno extermination camp in April 1942. He returned to Poland in 1946. On the way back in May 1946, while still in Russia, he married my grandmother, who was 20-something years his junior, and who he had known for a few years in Siberia. And then my father was born they returned to Poland, then they fled Poland for Paris. My father was born in Paris. And then in 1950, they moved to Australia. And, you know, my dad was raised in this little cottage in an immigrant suburb of Melbourne, where there was a lot of love, a lot of food, but a lot of trauma too. And, you know, I think, as is fairly typical of the children of survivors, you know, they're sort of navigating this tricky terrain of partly being children, but also partly having a kind of caring role and sort of learning how to navigate the way their parents' trauma manifests. So that was partly my dad's story. And also I should say my aunt as well, Miriam, who I see is also here. Hi, Miriam. And so, you know, the book looks at how my dad's childhood and how he's kind of navigated that. And then also how that affected him as a father and what kind of father he was to me. So that's the story in a nutshell.
You're right. This is a story about fathers and sons. This book is about how sons reconceive of the world when their fathers are suddenly and unexpectedly gone. I'm still working out how I will cope with it. Still new to being fatherless. Years later, the pain is still raw. Maybe it will always be. So if you can tell us more about it. Your father died in 2015. Yeah. The book came out in 2019. So did you know that you are going to write about your family before he died? Or was it a decision that came because he died, because it was so difficult to cope, and then you linked your story to his story, to your grandfather? Tell us more about this fathers and sons story that evolved here.
So Dad died just over 5. We just had his 50th say at the end of December. And I would say in some ways, some of the things that from what you just read out are still true, right? Like the rawness in some ways are still there. And the writing of the book, I mean, no, I certainly didn't intend to write a memoir before Dad died. That wasn't on the cards. I had sort of tinkered a little bit. I co-edited a volume with a friend and colleague, Geordie Silverstein, who's out there. Hi, Geordie. On grandchildren of survivors. And I wrote a chapter that was kind of tinkering with this idea of like bringing in, you know, sort of combining the scholarly with my own sort of personal history on the question of being the grandson of survivors. But I really didn't think about taking it further than that. And then after Dad died, probably 6 or 8 months after he died, the idea of telling his and my grandfather's story seemed like a bit of a way to deal with the grief. You know, I read this book on writing memoir by Mary Carr, and she said one thing not to do is write a memoir just because you're grieving. I kind of thought, all right, thank you for the advice, but I'm going to do my own thing here.
You're going to do it nonetheless.
I'm going to do it anyway. The impetus really came in about August 2016. So about 8 or 9 months after Dad died. And I was doing some teaching for an organization called Yiddishkeit LA, who do, they run programs around East European Jewish history. And they asked me to come to LA and give a couple of talks on the Bund. And the idea was just to give like general historical talks, drawing on my expertise as a historian of the Bund. And on the plane over there from Charleston, I kind of scrapped my notes and thought, you know what, I'm going to talk about the Bund, but I'm going to talk about it through the lens of my family's sort of long-standing connection, because my family's connection to the Bund goes back about a century. And I thought that's a way to tell the story. Like, I'll get the sort of key big historical picture in, but I'll do it in this kind of intimate way. And just one more quick shout out while I'm on that, you know, one of the coordinators there and teachers was Mindel Cohen, who's resident in the region at Amherst. So hello to Mindel. So that night, like, I gave the talks and I thought they went pretty well. And I kind of enjoyed it, and it was very emotional. Like, I remember we sung Die Schwur, which is the Bundist anthem. Like, we were all just in this seminar room in a seminary in Pasadena, and someone handed around the lyrics and we stood up and someone refused to stand up, which I thought was kind of funny. I still think is kind of funny. And so I got back to the room and I called my wife and I was like, I'm going to write this book and it's going to be called The Most Boring Memoir Ever Written. And it's going to be about me and my family. And, you know, it just like partly it was like dealing with the grief. And I thought, what's the way that I know how to like process what I'm thinking about and feeling and difficulties? And writing was something that came naturally. Just being a writer, like it made sense to write what I was sort of thinking and feeling. And also I read so much when Dad died, like so much of the way I reacted was to read grief memoirs, to read father-son things. And I didn't quite read things that, I didn't quite find things, I guess, that really like reflected what I was feeling or what I felt like I was experiencing. So I also thought that was a good way to deal with it too, is to write something and put something out in the world that, because like my dad died, I was 31 and he was 67. And I kind of thought that, well, that's a weird age. It's like an in-between age. It's this age where like, I've had a very fulfilling relationship with him. And he's had a very fulfilling life, but also had like, he was very vibrant, like a lot more life to live. And so it just struck me that it's like a kind of weird in-between age to pass away at 67. Like it's young, but not that young, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. So I'm sorry.
Oh no, go ahead.
One theme in the book is indeed the loss of a father, and that your father, his loss of his father. Another, which is connected but not identical, are the ghosts. You say it's a story of ghosts. The ghosts are important protagonists in this story. Actually, the last sentence of the book is about ghosts. That even if you think that you overcame the ghosts, well, they are going to visit you. So, that we are surrounded by these ghosts. Of course, I assume these are the ghosts of the Holocaust. I ask this because all families have ghosts, even if they are not connected to the Holocaust. So, were these ghosts that interested you, only about the Holocaust, or were there also ghosts that we all want to know things about our parents or about our family that we don't know, and maybe that we shouldn't know also? So if you can tell us something about this ghost theme that runs through the book.
I think the first ghost for me was my grandfather. In thinking about this idea of like the ghosts that are present, because I didn't know my grandfather. He died before I was born in 1978. So he died in 1978, which is before I was born. And, you know, he was always a presence in a way. Like my dad talked about him a lot. And I always, when I was a kid, lamented, like I had 3 grandparents, which like in hindsight is not, it's pretty good. Like my dad had 2 grandparents. That was and my mum had 1, and like even having any grandparents for them was a miracle in their context. But I had 3, and I always lamented only having 3. And you know, I was very close to those 3 grandparents, but there was something about my Zeta not being there and sort of looming large in my dad's psyche. That sort of like was a big thing for me. So like it is true that the ghosts are the ghosts of the Holocaust. And in ways that I didn't understand then, like I understood my Zeta wasn't there and I wanted to know what he would have been like. I always wanted to know what our relationship would have been like. Would he have been proud of me? Would he have been this or that? And I think like only once I delved much deeper into the story, like did I see the ghosts, his ghosts, that really like I see as all of our ghosts as well. You know, his wife and 2 sons who were murdered, and the ways in which, like, they clearly haunted him. But they haunt us all, whether we realized it or not. And this is part of what I'm saying in the book. Like, I didn't always like, I knew that Zeta had lost his first family. I grew up knowing that. My dad used to tell me about how they were burnt in the ovens at Chelmno. And actually, like, what I know now, being a historian and having, like, delved into it, is they were actually burned in pits at Chelmno. I went and visited them about a year ago. But this image of the oven loomed really large for me, like, and my grandfather's family being burnt in crematoria. And I imagined, like, the oven, that meaning like our kitchen oven. It was so, like, far outside of the realm of anything I could imagine as a kid. So, like, those ghosts, you know, like, they loomed pretty large. I think not only in terms of just, like, the trauma that left on my grandfather, but also, like, the ways in which he raised his children, and then the ways in which his children raised us. So, yeah, I think this motif of ghosts that runs through the book is really important. Like, partly, also, my dad very weirdly believed in ghosts. Like, he said he saw ghosts literally when he was, you know, he had a few stories of seeing ghosts in Papua New Guinea when he was a young man, but also just like this, and don't laugh, or you can laugh. There's the ghost that he woke up one in the middle of one night, and there was a headless lumberjack sitting at the end of his bed. And I'm sure it was like whatever drugs he was taking as a young man in his mid-20s, but he was pretty adamant that he had seen ghosts. And so I thought it was, like, amazing to think about this, you know, just this presence, like ghosts as this presence we can't quite tap into, but also something kind of very, very real in a way. Right, there's the kind of liminality of ghosts that they come and go, but also they're also constant in certain ways.
One of the most fascinating parts of the book for me was the story of the Bund. Not simply the story of the party of the Bund as a Jewish party at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th, the biggest Jewish political movement in Poland and in Russia, actually, much bigger than the Zionist movement. I'd like you to tell us briefly about the Bund, but I especially found it fascinating that you grew up in a youth movement of the Bund, and that everybody around were Bundists. It was like throwback to pre-1939 Poland for me when I read it. I didn't know that there was a youth movement of the Bund. So if you can tell us a little bit about it and the flair of it, it has something so beautiful, and also really that belongs to a different era. So if you can tell us more about the Bund in general and about your experience there.
Sure. So the Bund was founded in 1897, the same year as, and not coincidentally, the same year as the Zionist movement. And it was socialist, Yiddish-oriented, I mean, I guess I'd say Marxist, and very much believed that Jewish problems ought to be solved in the places where Jews lived. So, you know, instead of the idea of immigration as a solution, and particularly Jewish political sovereignty in Palestine, the Bundists thought the way you solve the problems that Jews face, including anti-Semitism, including poverty, is to, in the Russian context, overthrow the Tsar. Or in the Polish context, is to, you know, like agitate for a more socialist, democratic society. And particularly kind of in concert with non-Jews as well. They saw that as very important. So the Bund was a major an underground political movement in Russia. They participated in the Russian Revolution. I would say they reached their zenith in interwar Poland, the period my grandfather discovered and participated, where they were illegal movements. They had maybe in terms of membership, 10,000 or so people, but then they kind of like had all these activities that reached many more people. Really like this elaborate counterculture that meant you could be part of the Bund at any stage of your life. They had sports auxiliaries, they had a women's auxiliary, they had children's movements, unions, they co-sponsored particularly. And then once the war broke out, the Bund was ostensibly, you know, they participated in underground movements, but as a movement in Poland, they were ostensibly destroyed. Because like most Jews in Poland, most Bundists were murdered. So they tried to rebuild, but unsuccessfully because communism overwhelmed Poland in 1949 and they outlawed the Bund. So the Bund re-established itself in cities around the world, about 31 cities around the world, including Melbourne, Australia, in 1950. And they set up this, basically a slice of interwar Jewish Poland, I would say, in a suburban Melbourne. And my grandparents and parents were a part of that. So, you know, my grandfather was, like I said earlier, he was like a generation older than most of the people in that movement. Like a lot of those people had survived the war in their 20s. And he was already, by the time he came to Australia, nearly 50. So he was like an elder statesman for many of these Bundists. And, you know, they had this little cottage in Carlton, which is an inner city, like immigrant neighborhood, or was. Now it's very posh. You know, the house that they sold for $45,000 in 1975 would now sell for nearly $2 million. You know, their house was this center of life. Like people would come late at night after work and they would sit around and talk about politics and try and solve the problems of the world over a vodka and a slice of herring. And it was, they sort of created this very robust little world. You know, we're talking a few hundred families probably, but very dynamic. And by the time I came along, there still today, by the way, is an active Bund movement. They still have the youth movement SCIF. They just had their summer camp. My son goes to SCIF. You know, he's, I guess, a fourth or fifth generation Bundist in some ways. So, you know, in some ways it sort of seems very quaint and very surprising to a lot of people. I didn't realize this growing up. I thought it was perfectly normal. Really probably until I moved to America in 2013, I thought it was perfectly normal to grow up in a Yiddish socialist environment. And, you know, like certainly living in America showed me how weird that was. Because I rarely met anyone else who grew up in anything analogous to that. You know, people who went to Habonim or other Zionist movements, that's the best analogy, but certainly not anything like a Bundist movement in the 1990s. So yeah, when I think about it now, it's like a strange relic in a way, but perfectly normal, like in the context here.
Yeah, no, it's beautiful. It's the world that would have been had the Holocaust didn't happen in some ways.
In a way, but I think, you know, one of the things about the Bundists has always been they consider themselves like a here and now party. So the idea that you respond and adapt to the situation that you're in. So, you know, the Bund is like now it's very much like embedded in the local context. It's an Australian movement that responds. You know, we just had the day that marks the anniversary when the British colonized Australia, either Australia Day or Invasion Day, depending on where you sort of fall on the spectrum. And, you know, the Bundists, they put out like statements around the fact that the land that we sit on has never been ceded, that it's Aboriginal land. So, you know, they're kind of, that's by way of saying, like, they still adapt and become an Australian movement. They're not simply a Polish Jewish movement in an Australian context.
You tell about how the Holocaust was commemorated in these camps. There was a Churban that is not Holocaust or Shoah Tag day, but Churban, which is the Yiddish way, destruction, to commemorate. And you also tell in vivid detail about one time that you were responsible for this commemoration, and you gave a speech that involved Jewish use of violence in the present and what are the lessons of the Holocaust, and you criticized Israel. Can you tell us a little bit about this and about the reaction of the community, and why did you decide to do it? I found it interesting that your book commemorates the Holocaust, but it has also a subversive element about that is trying to think how we commemorate it, why we think about it, what are the implications. And this story was part of this larger topic.
I think I've always been interested in this question, partly because of the weird ways in which I was taught about the Holocaust, and the weird way, I say weird and that's probably a bit ungenerous, but like the ways that I received, like I don't remember, and probably Alon, for you it's the same, you probably don't remember when you learned about the Holocaust, you just always knew about it because of the context that I was raised in. I just always knew about the Holocaust. But in a way it was like done with a sledgehammer. You know, when I was in primary school or elementary school, at Holocaust memorial assemblies, they would like put up giant images of the Warsaw Ghetto and maps of Europe that listed where the camps and ghettos were, and the windows were blackened. And, you know, when you're 4 and 5 years old, that's reasonably confronting, I think, to you know, be taught about the Holocaust in that way. And then on camp, you know, the weird ways we were taught about the Holocaust, like these Churban, particularly when I was younger, the counselors, I guess is the best analogy, would organize simulations of like the Warsaw Ghetto. So we as kids would be the Jews. So imagine like British Bulldog, you know, this game that kids play. And we, the kids, are the Jews, and the helper or the counselors are the Nazis. And we're trying to like evade the Nazis. Or like the day when they did a simulation of a death march and a train to Auschwitz, and like stuff where you think about it today and it would blow your mind to expose children to this. Not that simulations were so unusual, but simulating those things was really strange. You know, I remember sort of communal discussions about the date of when it should be commemorated. So we always commemorated on the 19th of April, which was the first day of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And you know, if you want to read an excellent book about why the 19th of, or the debate about the date and the meaning of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, read Avinoam Pat's forthcoming book from Wayne State University Press. And you're out there, Avi, somewhere, so you're welcome for the plug. But that date for the Bundes became really important, the 19th of April, the day that the fighters in the Warsaw Ghetto initiated an uprising against the Nazis.
The same day that Israel commemorates the...
Right, except with the one crucial difference, and that is that Israel does it on the Jewish calendar,
right,
and the Bundes maintain it on the Goyish calendar, for want of a better word. So, and that's a crucial difference, because I remember the conversations about when the 19th of April fell on Pesach, on first or second night Seder, and what do you do about it? Because 19th of April 1943 was a Seder night, right? That they launched the uprising on Pesach. So some argued, so they would have like big communal discussions where they would say, well, what should we do? And some would say, well, they launched the uprising on Pesach, so we should keep it that way. And I had this growing feeling of, well, that's kind of excludes people who don't want to, for whatever reason, don't want to observe it on Pesach, so we should move it. And often those discussions were heated. So like this question of how to commemorate the Holocaust has always been fairly a live one for me, and actually something I've been pretty conscious of basically since I was a teenager. And so when I ran the Bund's Holocaust commemorations for a few years, I tried to like shake things up a bit and do things that were a little bit provocative, I guess, and different, and made people think a little more about the meaning of the Holocaust. Not just a kind of empty ritual where you just came and did the same thing and you cried and then you went and got pizza afterwards and had a laugh, but where it really like left an impression. And sometimes that hit the mark and sometimes it missed the mark. And one year I gave a speech, and that year, the 19th of April fell on Yom Ha'atzmaut. And so the night that we were commemorating the Holocaust, on the other side of town, there was a big celebration of Israel's independence. And I just felt like I couldn't ignore that when I was giving a speech. Like I had to address what I thought was an elephant in the room. It also happened to be the year after Marek Edelman died, and Edelman was one of the commanders of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. He was a Bundist who survived, and he was like a pretty gutsy, I would say, outspoken political figure, both against Polish communism and at times like, in favor of Palestinian rights. So I just thought...
Anti-Zionist.
And an anti-Zionist. And that's why he stayed in Poland, or one reason. So I just thought it was important to address that. So I talked about the nature of Jewish power and the responsibility in the wake of the Holocaust when you have power to exercise it responsibly. And I suggested that the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza had already been disengaged, but the occupation in Israel was not in keeping with that responsibility. And that didn't go down very well, both, I think, for two reasons, both because of the content, because people disagreed with me politically, but also the question of what is it appropriate to talk about in the setting of a Holocaust commemoration? Can you talk about politics and the present day? And I argued at the time that, of course, like it's all political. The lessons we take away from the Holocaust determine how we move about the world. So it caused a bit of consternation. I got heckled, which was not a typical thing at the Bund's Holocaust commemoration.
And maybe it's not atypical in Holocaust commemoration in general. Certainly in Israel, every year there are similar controversies about what are the lessons of the Holocaust, considering violence, human rights, how Israelis behave, etc. So
yeah, I think that's interesting as well. Like it would, to give a speech like that in Israel would have been far less controversial than to give it in Melbourne. It was really like a third rail topic to talk about Israel in that context.
Yeah.
I was very indignant at the time about the reaction, but I'm not anymore. It's nearly 10 years ago, and I'm slowly getting over it.
I think it's our job to show that what is political is in the eye of the beholder.
Right.
Of course, for some people, it is what they think is political is itself political, because other things are natural. So.
Yeah, I think in that case, like what made it political was that people didn't agree with my politics.
Exactly.
It's like people who say keep politics out of sport when there's when like a football player takes a knee, it's like, well, football is political and sports are political. It's just you don't agree with their politics. So I think that was, I kind of felt at the time like part of it was that, is that what made it, because I just think remembering the Holocaust is inherently political, and the ways in which we remember, and that's true. And like, just to cite Avi again here, like Avi shows that even in 1943 and 44, the way that the memory of the Holocaust is being constructed was deeply political. And the way we remember the Holocaust is shaped along political boundaries.
Every remembrance is a political act if it is a social event. And certainly the Holocaust has been from the beginning political in what are the lessons that you can draw from it. Some people can draw the lesson that one can link it to Iran's atomic bomb, and another can link it to Jews have responsibility for all human beings to be humane, and so that's what
I'll give an example in the Australian context. Just yesterday, the federal treasurer, I heard him on the radio and he wrote an op-ed in one of the newspapers, and he's Jewish. I guess he's the most senior, probably holds the most senior office that a Jews held in Australian politics. Maybe someone can correct me if I'm wrong. But he's on the conservative side of politics. And, you know, he was interviewed about the importance of Holocaust Memorial Day, and they're talking about building a Holocaust museum in Canberra, the national capital. And, you know, part of me just was listening to the interview thinking, like, this is a member of a party who lock up asylum seekers and refugees in detention on remote islands indefinitely. And, you know, it's a party who like fails, I think, to acknowledge the genocide that was committed against the Indigenous population in Australia. And just to add a layer of complexity to this, Holocaust Memorial Day falls one day after Invasion Day. And so at the same time as the government is basically refusing to acknowledge the impact of colonization on Indigenous people, the next day they're on the radio talking about the importance of Holocaust memory. And to me, it's just so much cognitive dissonance. It's exactly the opposite message, right? That to say it's so important to remember the victims, but then to lock, you know, people seeking asylum from genocide up in concentration camps ostensibly.
Well, perhaps one way to think about it, it's very comfortable to remember the victims that you did not create. And it costs nothing to commemorate the Holocaust. There's only gain. I mean, symbolic gain, I want to say. It's a universal symbol of evil that other people did, and you just join. But when you have to commemorate the victims that you produced, it becomes much more difficult. In America, we had a Holocaust museum on the mall, on the National Mall, many years before we had the African American Museum. There is a reason. So
yeah.
So I want to ask you last question before we open up the discussion, and please send us your questions and comments and queries. I want to ask you about the writing. You are a historian. You wrote a memoir. It's a different kind of writing. What have been the relations between being trained as a historian and then writing a memoir, which is a literary aspect? What have you learned? What were the surprises? Do you find now that your historical writing is also influenced by this more literary way, or you find the two genres distinct? If you can tell us more about this.
One thing I've been saying to people for a few years now is I think more historians should write memoir. Because I think any age. You know, I can't be one to argue that you have to wait till later in life.
Exactly.
But I think historians, one thing that I think like my training as a historian and my perspective as a historian allowed me to do was like situate the micro history of a family in the broader historical, political, and cultural context. And I think that's not to say only historians can do that, but I think historians are uniquely trained to do that. I think it is tricky to tell your own story and like to sort of maintain some kind of distance. And what I tried to do in the book is have kind of three voices that were overlapping. So there was my voice as a kind of participant, sort of telling my memories or whatever. There was the voice of my dad, and particularly my grandfather, whose letters I found and quoted from a lot and reproduced one of them completely. And then my voice as a historian, where I kind of like gave the context for everything. And, I couldn't really talk about Chelmno without explaining to the reader what that is, because the truth is, like, most people don't know about Chelmno. Most Jews don't know much or anything about Chelmno, let alone a general readership. So, I had to kind of overlap those things. And I think as a historian, like moving between those modes was something I had to experiment with and play with, and integrating the voices effectively, not having it. I remember one early reader said it was a bit jarring to go between that personal and the sort of general historical voice. But I do think being a historian allows you to like take sources, allows you to find materials that you need, allows you to infer things about stories you don't know. This obviously, like so many stories about the Holocaust, we have scraps and we have to fill in so many gaps. And it's not so easy when you're dealing with people who have died, when there's not a lot of archival material that like tells specifically of that story. So I had to do a lot of trying to situate what might have happened, what could have happened. I had these photos, albums of photos from the post-war years, and I figured out from putting the photos alongside some of the letters, like where the photos were, because I could sort of like match up the descriptions from the letters with the things that were happening in the photos. So things like that, being a historian and sort of doing that just as a scholar generally, that helped me do that. So, that is to say, Alon, it's time to start planning your memoir, I think.
Well, maybe I am planning it, but that's for another talk.
I mean, and in a way, I think it has certainly influenced my writing, like they are different when I write more strictly scholarly works. And I don't want to distinguish this from being a scholarly work, because I do see the book as also scholarly. My voice is different, but I guess I do try and write in a way that is very readable.
Accessible.
And it tells a story.
Really accessible. And it's the topic is difficult, but the book reads very well, and you want to continue to read. It's beautifully written.
Thank you.
I was wondering when I read it, were there Holocaust memoirs that influenced you when you wrote it, or other memoirs? Were there books about family memoirs that have nothing to do with the Holocaust that have influenced you?
I think the book that influenced me the most, it's not exactly a memoir, but it's this book called, there's a couple of translations of it, either To Outwit God. The version I had was To Outwit God, which was an interview that the Polish journalist Hanna Kral did with Marek Edelman. Mm-hmm. And it's this kind of long-ranging interview. It's 100-something page book in which he talks about the Warsaw Ghetto and remembrance of it. And that was a huge influence. You know, the way he talked in such an unvarnished way about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the way he like broke down these sacred cows and myths, that was a big influence on just generally how I think about the Holocaust and how I write about it. You know, when I started writing, and I decided not to read any memoirs until I finished writing the first draft of the whole book, because I kind of thought I could read a whole lot of them, and then I would end up, I think, trying to write those books. And I really wanted to like try and have a bit of a clear mind about the kind of memoir I wanted to write. So I had, you know, I mean, I think many of us have read Mouse, and that things like that have been very influential, but I didn't think as I was writing specifically about what are the memoirs that I want to emulate. I was actually trying to think a little bit against that. And, you know, it can sound so obnoxious to say it and say like, oh, I didn't want anyone to taint my artistic genius or whatever, but it wasn't like that. It was more that, you know, I was a bit worried actually that if I read too many memoirs at the time, then I would end up, even inadvertently, writing someone else's memoir in a way. And so I think in a way, I approached it more as a historian in that sense than I did as a memoirist. And then after I finished the first draft, then I read a bit of amazing memoir. I really loved Nadia Spiegelman's memoir, actually the Art Spiegelman's daughter, which is not about Spiegelman and the Holocaust and Mouse. It's about her relationship with her mother and her grandmother, actually. And that was, I thought, really powerful. I really loved Daniel Mendelssohn's, not The Lost, actually, although I like The Lost, but I loved his book, An Odyssey, which is about him teaching the Odyssey and his father coming into the class. And I really loved that. Yes, you know, those are a couple of recent ones that I read in between drafts that I was like, these are really just powerful and beautifully written, and reflect that parent-child relationship in really interesting ways.
Please write us your questions. We have one question about which you discussed briefly, but maybe you want to elaborate. After spending some time in the US, now you are back in Australia, and whether you've noticed changes in the Jewish community as well as Australian society's relationship to the Holocaust.
I think in some ways coming back has reinforced what I knew about like the centrality of the Holocaust to Australian Jewish life. But also, like, I used to think that it was weird, like that Australia was, because like colleagues and Americans would tell me how unusual Melbourne, you know, Melbourne, it's very central to the foundational narrative of the Melbourne Jewish community. And actually having lived in South Carolina for nearly 7 years, I actually think it's more universal than I realized. You know, certainly I knew from a scholarly perspective about the role that the Holocaust played in American Jewish life and American life broadly, but, you know, actually being immersed in that and seeing just how important the Holocaust is within like the communal calendar, for example, the communal institutions, it sort of made me realize Melbourne isn't quite the outlier that I thought it was and that people told me it was. So I think that's one big thing that I realized. I guess the other thing, Shari, it's in some ways it's just hard to say about what I've noticed in Australia because we've all been locked down. So like I've been sitting in this room for much of the last 12 months. You know, I guess another thing I noticed is like the broader Australian society's relationship with the Holocaust. In that regard, like it's much more central in American life than it is in Australian life. Although, you know, there was like some radio interviews and yesterday about International Holocaust Memorial Day, and there was a documentary on Auschwitz on TV, but that was about the extent of it. I guess what's surprised me a little bit is the prevalence of like neo-Nazis and the alt-right in Australia. You know, I think it's actually quite analogous to what's happening in the US right now. Yeah, Australia's certainly not immune. Like there was just a big story in the newspaper today about like these Nazis in a country town, like having some gathering over Invasion Day. And I think that, yeah, in a way, just thinking about like the role of Jews in Australian society has been more something I've thought about than the role the Holocaust plays. I'll say this, I was a little bit more agitated about all the Christmas stuff coming back to Australia than I ever was in America. I realized that, you know, it's weird having Christmas in the middle of summer.
I want to ask you, do you think you are the last generation to write a Holocaust memoir? And I thought about this question because you put in succession your great-grandfather, your grandfather, your father, yourself, and your son, Arthur. But maybe for Arthur, the Holocaust will be so removed that even the intergenerational trauma will be different. So to write a book will seem, maybe he will have other experiences that will be. I'm asking maybe the third generation. Just a question that arose to me when I read it. Maybe the third generation is the last one to write.
Like I reckon there'll be memoirs. I just think they'll be different. Like because the third generation memoirs are really preoccupied often with relationships with grandparents who experienced it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's about like processing those relationships and the way the stories get told and the way they're mediated by an intermediate generation. And so there is something, you know, I think third generation memoirists are really dealing with their familial relationships as much as they're dealing with the Holocaust.
Right, yeah.
And I think, you know, things that like, I don't know if Arthur's generation will like come across the box full of letters, you know, those kind of things that we still find because you clear out your grandparents' garage and there's these amazing artifacts that you can tell the stories about. That's probably not going to exist to the same extent for that generation. And I think also the other factor is like, as a parent, you know, like it filters through the generations. So the way my dad and his sister experienced their parents' trauma is very different to how I experienced it. And that's going to be very different again. So, yeah, I think partly we parent around that as well. You know, we raise our kids with that knowledge. So like, I don't want Arthur to learn about the Holocaust in the way that I did. Because I think in ways that's traumatizing for children.
Yeah, well, he will not.
I think I'm generally, you know, well-adjusted. But, you know, I think like to teach kids about the Holocaust in the ways that we learnt about it, I think we probably know now that it's not best practice, if you will. So I think we parent with the knowledge of how our parents parented, and I think as parents, we try to take the good and let go and learn from the bad. So yeah, I don't know if I'd say I'm in the last generation of Holocaust memoirists. I just think what it's going to mean for the next generation is going to look very different. You know, it's going to be a world mainly without survivors. So what does it mean to write about the Holocaust as a descendant of a generation that's no longer there?
Yeah.
It'll raise interesting questions, I think.
We have a question. What do you think about the efficacy of monuments and memorials in remembering, teaching, and confronting the Holocaust? And maybe if you can juxtapose the historical case of the Holocaust and your experience in Charleston, which is of course about slavery and the Civil War. If there's any insights about this relationship?
Yes, thank you, Sam, for that question. And I in some ways I should defer to you on this question of memorials, but I'll have a stab at it. Like, I think, I don't think monuments and memorials teach about the Holocaust. And I'll use the one in Charleston as an example. So for people who've been to Charleston, you'll probably have seen in the center of town, it's gone now, but there was about 100-foot tall, or a statue that stood 100 feet tall of John C. Calhoun, the kind of intellectual force behind the idea that slavery was a good thing in the first half of the 19th century. He was a vice president. And about, I would say, 50 or 70 meters from there, in the same public square in the center of Charleston, was a whole modernist, I thought very moving Holocaust memorial. And so those memorials interacted in or monuments and memorials that interacted in funny ways. But I thought it was a very effective memorial, but it had a couple of 100 words of text. So I don't think you can really learn about the Holocaust that way. That's not to say that memorials don't serve their purpose. I think they do. But I think education is, has to filter through in much more profound ways at broader levels. So I think having a Holocaust memorial in the center of a city like Charleston, I thought was actually quite weird because there weren't very visible monuments to slavery or Jim Crow or, the experience of the people who had suffered there, in that very spot. And actually there were tons of Confederate monuments and Revolutionary War monuments. So I actually think in some ways, a place like that, Holocaust monuments often obscure as much as they illuminate. So they obscure the history, the really dark history that took place in that spot, in favor of a narrative that, as Alon said earlier, it's much more comfortable to commemorate victims of something else than it is to sort of confront our own dark past. So in some ways it creates a bit of a screen memory, the Holocaust memorials. But I think they have their place, particularly on the sites where they happen. I think they're particularly important on location. But yeah, for a bunch of reasons, I guess that is to say I'm kind of ambivalent. I'm a little bit ambivalent about memorials. Yes. Alon, did you have you must have thoughts on that too?
Yeah. Well, but monuments cannot do the work by themselves. Of course, societies have to remember. People have to remember. Some of the most evocative monuments are evocative because we give them meaning. I think, for example, at the Opernplatz in Berlin, where the Nazis burned books, and where now there is a memorial, which is a room underground. You have to look inside a window, and you see a room full of shelves, but they have no books. The absence, the emptiness is so powerful, but it's powerful because we give it meaning. So this is the answer. I think the monuments cannot speak by themselves.
And also, it's also powerful, by the way, because you already know the history coming into it.
Exactly.
So
yeah,
it can only be effective if you're already educated about the Holocaust.
Exactly. I taught for many years at the University of Virginia, and I see some friends from UVA, Jeffrey Grossman and Gabby Finder, as I said, and Jennifer Gaddis. And a few years ago, there was a commission by the city to think what to do with the Confederate monuments. There is a monument for Robert E. Lee and a few others. And the committee that included some historians, my colleagues from the history department, decided not to destroy them and not to remove them, but to add something to the monument. To say this was built, in the late 19th, beginning of the 20th century, and it reflected a certain historical context. And now we think about differently. We are not going to remove it, but we are going to explain it. We are going to make it a little bit more complex. And we are going to say that now, most of us don't believe in this anymore, but it doesn't mean that we have to move it. I thought it was a very good, a good way to commemorate the different kind, the alternative monument. Of course, it requires people to read. I mean, even if it's going to be 100 words, you have to read something. The monument is very imposing of Lee on the horse, but I thought it could work very well. And I think they haven't decided what they shelved this report, and they haven't decided what to do. Perhaps the UVA people who are in the audience can write us a chat about it if I'm so I think maybe we should, unless we have more questions and more queries. David, can I ask you to maybe, if not sing the entire Shvua, at least maybe sing a few lines or give us I'm very curious to hear the music, and I guess it is in Yiddish also.
Yeah, it's in Yiddish. So I guess I should say, here's the book. This is the expensive hardback version, but I've given you a link to the paperback.
And Mindy just said that she will sing along at home, and she will also stand.
Schönen Dank. Yes, you have to stand, but I feel awkward standing because then you're just going to see my chest. What I will say quickly, and I will sing you a couple of lines.
Just a minute. Maybe I will tell the audience that David and I did not prepare this question, so I absolutely surprised him. And if he will say that he doesn't want to do it, it's perfectly fine as well.
No, I'll sing a couple of lines. But I will say that the book is called Sing This at My Funeral, and the this in the title refers to this song, Die Schwur, which is the anthem of the Bund, and I explain it more in the book, but we used to sing it at the end of Bund meetings. I mean, I never learned it at Skiff as a kid, but I learned it a bit later, because at the end of a Bund anniversary or just a general meeting, they would sing the Schwur. And Dad always used to tell me the story at his father's funeral in 1978. There were lots of Bundists alive still, like sort of first generation Bundists, I guess you would call them, still alive then. And they sang the Schwur at his funeral, and Dad would always say to me, make sure you sing this at my funeral. And I was like, yeah, whatever. Like, what a weird, silly thing to say. And then he said it to me again, the last time we sang it together was about 3 days before he died. Like, he died unexpectedly. We didn't know that. But this, memory of him saying that to me at this event in New York City at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, where he stood and sang it, it sticks very, very much in my mind. So, all right, I'll sing you a couple of lines. Brüder und Schwester von Arbeit und Neut, alle was seinen zerseht und zerspreit, zusammen, die vorn ist kreit, sie flattert von Zorn, von Blut ist sie heut, a Schwur, euch Leben und Teut. And I won't go on and sing the chorus, but that's the most I've sung in public since high school. So,
David, thank you so much. It was a wonderful ending for a great conversation and a great book. I recommend everyone to read it. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me. It was so great to talk. And Alon, I'm really honored that you invited me and that you reacted so positively to the book.
Sounds good. Thank you all. Be well and stay safe.
Thanks everyone for tuning in as well.